Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for taking the time to join our webinar today. We're going to go through a couple of things of housekeeping first, so looking at the welcome and introductions, a little bit about a background on cloud computing, why the Cloud Computing Foundation certification, why is it relevant, some of the advantages of this qualification, and a little bit of overview of the certification content, and we will have a Q&A at the end. If you have any questions during the webinar, please feel free to just type them into your chat box, and we'll be answering them at the end of the webinar. I hope you enjoy it. So I'm your moderator for today, Nigel Mercer. I'm the Region Manager and Commercial Lead for APMG International. And Bernard, perhaps you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks so much, Nigel. I'm Bernard Golden, and I am the Chief Examiner for this qualification, and so I wanted to tell you a little bit about myself. So I've been working in cloud computing really since before it was called cloud computing. I wrote Virtualization for Dummies for Dummies Press, and in it I had a chapter on the future of virtualization. Where is virtualization going to go over the next 10 years? And I got exposed to this new service that's just been launched by Amazon called Amazon Web Services. And I looked at that and I said, that is the platform over the next 20 years, because that makes infrastructure much more consumable, much faster, much cheaper. So I've been working in cloud computing ever since that time because I thought it was going to be such a profound change in IT, and I think that's really been borne out. I developed the first cloud computing training offered anywhere in the world. I'm the cloud computing advisor for CIO Magazine, so I do a blog there on sort of observing what's going on with cloud computing trends, enterprise adoption, challenges, so forth and so on. It's read by many, many people around the world. Wired.com was kind enough to name me one of the 10 most influential people in cloud computing. And I've co-authored 4 books, including Amazon Web Services for Dummies, which was named one of the top 5 cloud computing books. And as I mentioned, I serve as Chief Examiner for this qualification.
Thanks, Bernard. That's quite an impressive resume, I must say.
Well, thank you.
I'd like to tell everybody a little bit about APMG before we start. I won't spend a lot of time on this because everybody wants to hear about cloud. Most of you on the webinar probably know APMG, but we are a global examination and accreditation institute. We're headquartered in the UK. We've got operational offices or representation in 12 countries around the world. We've accredited over 550 training organizations and product owners around the globe as well. But I think this is the telling statistic. Over 1.3 million candidates from over 100 countries in 21 different languages have taken one of our certifications in the last 20-odd years. So we offer a broad base of products. We've been recognized recently as one of the leaders in security. We work with the UK government, with CESG, the Information Security Arm of the GCHQ, along with the Defense Science and Technology Laboratory. So our products adhere to the highest levels. We have a whole host of industry-recognized certifications around cyber, and cloud is literally one of those at the moment. But one of the very interesting ones, anybody wants to know more information, please feel free to have a look at our apmgcyber.com website. There's a lot of information on that site. Now, quite often, people ask us, well, what is an accreditation institute and an examining body? Yes, we provide exams. But if you go back one step from providing an exam, in order to provide an exam, you need to actually have intellectual property. And based on that intellectual property, you need to be able to build a qualification. And there are a lot of folks out there with great ideas and great intellectual property that don't really have the mechanisms or the idea on how to get those to the market. So this is where we come in. There's the intellectual property creator. Those are the folks who've built this great stuff out there. And we've got everybody else, the intellectual property consumers. Those are the businesses out there that are looking for best practices, for ideas, for intellectual property. It will help them in all sorts of ways, lower costs, enhance their business value, drive IT. There are so many different reasons why they want to consume. Think of us in the middle as the App Store for humans. Okay? APMG are the people that take those real-time idea streams that are delivered by intellectual property creators. We formulate them into sizable, bite-sized chunks that can be consumed, understood, used, and gathered the most value from So we sit in the middle as the App Store for humans. Bernard, just a couple of questions for you. Looking at cloud computing, why is now really the right time for a cloud computing certification?
Yeah, thanks, Nigel. Well, I guess what I would say is that, that sort of glimmer that I had a decade ago, that this was going to be the platform of the future, that really enterprise IT was going to revolve around cloud computing, is really coming to fruition. Some of these stats here, 88% of enterprises are using public cloud. 13% of enterprises run very large workload topologies, over 1,000 VMs. So, not a toy application or just a kind of a limited application, but really significant amounts of computing in public cloud environments. And 22% run the same sort of workloads in a private cloud. And there's part of what's going on, and we'll talk about this when we get into the content of it, is that there's a whole set of other changes that go along with using cloud computing. So it's not just like using your own on-premise infrastructure but located somewhere else. It's not even just virtualization hosted by someone else. There's a whole set of changes that are implied by or forced by cloud computing, and one of them is you really need to design and operate your applications quite differently. And we see here a stat that says 55% of enterprises report that a significant portion of their existing application portfolios are not in cloud but are built with cloud-friendly architectures. Now, the next one is quite interesting. 62% of enterprises report that central IT makes the majority of cloud spending decisions. That sounds quite impressive, but if you look at it, if you had said a decade ago what percentage are made by central IT, it probably would have been 90 or 100%. So part of what's gone on with cloud computing is a shift of use and decision-making into other parties inside corporations, so marketing departments or sales departments or finance or whatever. So there's sort of a distribution of that, and that's one of the big challenges for enterprises is there are so many people making cloud decisions and not a common basis of knowledge, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. And then 43% of IT teams are offering a self-service portal, meaning the old model was you were an application group or a developer and you said, I want to do some work. The first thing you do is you'd send in a trouble ticket request to central IT, and literally it could take anywhere from 6 weeks to 6 months for you to get back resources to compute. So you were sort of gated by that kind of 6 weeks to 6 month thing. You couldn't really start work. The vision for cloud computing is much more like buying a book from Amazon. You fill out a form, you hit submit, and then fulfillment happens automatically. There's no sort of sending in a trouble ticket or something like that. And self-service portal sort of brings that to life. And so one of the amazing things about cloud computing is you can submit a request to a cloud provider. 10 minutes later, you have resources, and that gives you the ability to start work in 10 minutes or 15 minutes, not 6 weeks or 6 months. So that's a big part here, is putting up this self-service portal to let people have access directly without having to submit trouble tickets and so forth. So this is sort of a good background on cloud computing. The trends going on, the adoption patterns, who's affected. I thought it might be very useful for us to look at a couple of real-world examples to kind of really bring home the vividness of what this implies. And so maybe we can take a look at the next slide.
Bernard, so looking at this, it appears that the spending shift is away from IT departments and into the business itself when people are making decisions on cloud, and that puts in a whole host of other problems, doesn't it?
Yes, it brings a range of one. How do you make sure that everyone uses a common terminology, uses the same practices, uses the same tools? Obviously, there's concerns about those groups that are adopting cloud outside the purview of central IT. How do you ensure that they're following the right processes, practices, have the right security measures, put in the right governance, follow the right regulations or laws that are applicable? So there's, how do you gain the appropriate level of consistency? How do you make sure that everybody has a common framework of knowledge? Really, how do you make sure that you don't have a proliferation of solutions? One group does it this way, another group does it that way, a third group does it yet a third way, and so on, because that introduces a lot of complexity into your cloud use it raises your operational costs, and it causes challenges around your skill base because you have to have people ready to manage all those different environments. So there's a lot of complexities that this sort of shift to direct user adoption of cloud brings up.
Very interesting. So what kind of impact is this really having on, the internet, users, organizations?
Yeah, well, first we're seeing a whole host of new offerings come to the market based on cloud computing. Here's one that probably almost everyone's familiar with, Netflix. Certainly everyone's heard of it, and it's quite interesting. Netflix has really revolutionized the way we consume content or video media, and it is so widely adopted that it accounts for 1/3 of all North American evening internet traffic. So think about that. 1/3 of all the packets that shunt around the United States in the evening are based on Netflix. They're us watching videos of one sort or another. And they're really quite a pioneer because they have shifted everything to run on Amazon Web Services, the cloud provider that I mentioned earlier. If you access Netflix services, it's running in the cloud. And so that's, and they have a huge footprint in Amazon. But they made the decision when they looked at how they were going to build out this service that while they had, they were a technology company, they have lots of smart technical people, they're located in Silicon Valley, they concluded that them being able to build and operate data centers was always going to be a gating factor for their ability to deliver their service and to grow, and that wasn't something they wanted to try and manage. So they turned to Amazon Web Services and said, they can take care of kind of the lower levels of that. We can focus on our service. And obviously they've been enormously successful. And this sort of stat about that they account for 1/3 of the traffic gives everyone an idea of the kind of magnitude of that.
Yeah, they certainly would need scale, wouldn't they? That's pretty big.
Yes, and they also need the ability to sort of grow and shrink their footprint according to that, because let's face it, there's a lot more demand for video at 8 in the evening than there is at 2 in the afternoon. And so they use Amazon so they can grow and shrink their footprint so they don't have a lot of wasted resources. A lot of people go, oh, that's fine. That's Netflix. We're not like Netflix. We're a standard issue company. We're a real enterprise. And that's a fair observation. But, this cloud computing revolution is by no means limited to so-called web scale companies. Here's an example that I recently came across. The CIO of GE got up at the most recent AWS conference and outlined their plans for cloud computing. Now, GE is a 150-year-old company, so it's no web scale company, internet-based, flash in the pan kind of company. It's the number 8 Fortune 500 company in the United States, so 8th largest company in the U.S. Their CIO got up and said, we're getting out of the data center business. We're going to shut down 30 of our 34 data centers and migrate 80% of our applications to the cloud. So they've concluded something analogous to Netflix. Our core competence is about what we do with this computing, not running the infrastructure itself. So we're going to really focus on the place that we can add value and find somebody who can do that infrastructure piece better than us. And this is quite telling because this gives you an idea of the kinds of trends. If a company the size of GE, the 8th largest company in the United States, says, even though we build unbelievable, functionality, very complex products, very technically based products, but we're not, our core competence is not running data centers. Really, that's applicable to everyone. So there's, that's evidence of how dramatic and how powerful this trend is.
Wow, that's quite interesting, I must say. Just looking at these statistics that we've got at the moment, it seems that IT spending on the cloud is literally only second to security spending, and hardware spending seems to be going down.
Yeah, there's no question. I don't think it takes anyone super insightful to say, the times are tough for the traditional system vendors, HP, Dell, IBM, and so forth. And what's interesting about that is, so cloud is being adopted, and I would bet that a significant chunk of that security technologies is for cloud-based applications. As I mentioned, cloud really enables but also forces a real change in the operational practices and so forth of IT, and part of that is security. You have to treat security differently in a cloud-based environment than you did in your traditional environment. So, I would say probably there's, a very large proportion of the spend and a very large, and certainly a dominant part of the growth in spend is being directed toward cloud applications, cloud environments, complementary functionality to add value or protect those cloud applications. Yeah, it's a huge thing, and really, wireless. An awful lot of wireless apps run in cloud environments. So, it affects all domains of spending, really.
Wow. So if you look at this, all the conversations I've had with folks who are adopting the cloud, they always turn around and say there's a couple of reasons why we aren't in the cloud. And, some of those seem to be security concerns, obviously, as you've mentioned, and some privacy regulations as well. That still seems to be a blocker to the cloud. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, there's definitely concerns about security. I mean, that's the number one concern. It has been, since the very start of cloud computing, particularly using public cloud. People are always concerned, how do I know that my data is safe? How do I know that, nobody can attack it? How do I know what the practices are of the cloud provider in terms of, following best practices for security? And then this other the other cloud here, the 38% privacy regulation. That's an enormous question that everyone has to figure out how to address that. Privacy of data or data regulation varies from country to country, and certainly region to region. The European Union is quite stringent about that, more so than the United States. Asia has a different regimen itself, and countries within those things, within that area. So it's quite challenging around this. However, what I would say is that these are, I would call them concerns, but not insoluble issues. So, many organizations have addressed these topics. They've figured out the right steps to take. They've implemented those things. They've satisfied themselves so they can accomplish them, and they take account of them, they implement their measures, and they continue to use cloud computing. So in other words, they're not something that is a roadblock that, says we can't go any further. It becomes a concern that you have to address. Certainly, I think it's fair to say that GE would not have, made the decisions it made and the announcement that it made if it felt, we can't protect our intellectual property if it's in the cloud, or we can't, ensure that our systems won't get hacked, or we're not confident in the ability of the cloud provider to secure its environment and premises with the right security practices. So those are important concerns. You have to make sure that you take the right measures. You have to understand what those measures are, but it's not something that is a showstopper in the sense that there's no way to solve it, and so I can't move in that environment. So, and I think we're actually going to talk about the security module here in a couple of minutes.
Yeah, a little bit later on.
And we'll talk about sort of, the topics that need to be addressed, but, it's a concern that you have to know how to address. So it's, if I can say it this way, it's kind of analogous to, if you drive a car, you need to know all the rules, you need to know how to do that, you need to know the regulations, and you need to follow them. But certainly nobody would say, well, it's complicated to know how to drive a car, therefore I'm not going to drive a car. People just, you sort of say that's part and parcel of taking advantage of this. And I would say that's an analogy.
Right. So, Bernard, why do you think a cloud certification is important right now?
Well, first, as I mentioned, that sort of vision that I had a decade ago, it's really, now present for everyone. The cloud is now accepted as a primary infrastructure platform by large and small enterprises. That stat said 88% are using public cloud. A large proportion are doing private cloud. This is really the platform of the future. I've heard people even opine that say, 5 years from now or 10 years from now, we won't use the term cloud computing. We'll just say computing because it'll be so accepted. But it is now the foundation. So it's absolutely critical for every organization to say, okay, this is the path forward. How do I know what to do? So it's now accepted as the primary infrastructure platform. Nobody's putting in, just what so-called bare metal servers, or even just plain virtualization. Cloud computing is the path forward. And part of that is knowing how to take advantage of the cloud is critical. If you're not doing it right, if you don't know all the features of it, the constraints, the issues that you have to address like security and data, so forth, if you don't know how to do that, you're going to be hampered. You're not going to have the most effective arrangement, and you're may, frankly, do things in a way that could be challenging or expose yourself to real problems. So it's critical to know how to do that. Organizations are leveraging cloud computing for competitive advantage. This is, in a way, cloud computing has enabled IT to move out of being an internally focused cost center that works with process automation and now externally focused. So, let's just use an example. If you were at Hilton, you used to think about how do I, use IT to track guests and make sure that I get the bills done properly and so forth. Very internally kind of stuff. Now you're competing with Airbnb and you have to figure out how do I reach out with systems, mobile applications that engage with my customers or prospects, that really involve with them, make sure that I'm able to listen to them well, deliver applications that they can use to make their stay here more efficient, and attract them to me. So all of a sudden IT is very much about being used about competitive advantage, and cloud computing is the foundation for that. This next point I think is probably underappreciated. You need consistent knowledge throughout the IT organization. As cloud has been adopted sort of piecemeal, as it's been adopted by groups within companies that traditionally didn't really adopt IT, there's highly varying approaches, there's highly varying levels of knowledge. There's not a consistent approach, and it's critical, since this is going to be the foundation platform going forward, that everyone be on the same sheet of paper, that everyone know the same knowledge, that everyone have the same terminology, that use common frameworks for your processes and so forth. So consistent knowledge, I think, is really critical. And you need a comprehensive approach. It can't be, that group does it one way and this other group doesn't do it, and then a third group isn't sure, but wants to talk to an external consultancy. You need a comprehensive approach, and the whole basis of that is to have a common set of knowledge and a common set of practices, and the certification provides that.
Thanks, Bernard. That makes perfect sense. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about what the course is actually going to cover.
Yeah, so we begin with a cloud computing overview and the benefits. So, because people still sort of go, well, cloud computing, it's a bit like that. The analogy that's often used is, I think it's a fable about a number of blind people who confront an elephant, and one feels its tail and says, oh, it's like a rope, and one feels its side, its abdomen, and says, oh, it's like a wall. Meaning, people have very different opinions about it. It's important to have a consistent foundation of what it is. So, cloud computing overview. We use the NIST definition out of the U.S. federal government, which is probably the most widely accepted definition across the globe. And then we talk about what that implies, the benefits of it. We also talk about the security and compliance challenges. That's a really critical issue because of all those things that we talked about on that slide about the 63% and 38% and so forth. So security and compliance challenges, understanding them and then understanding the mitigating factors, really important. But there's also technical and organizational challenges. I mentioned that you need to design applications differently. Well, what does that imply? That's a technical challenge that you need to understand. So we talk about those kinds of things and ways to address them and how to go about them. And organizational challenges. It's no secret that the level of enthusiasm for cloud computing varies in organizations. Some people are very much go ahead. End users are chomping at the bit, and certainly CEOs are saying, how come everything is taking so long? Let's go to cloud computing. So, there's all these different parties trying to figure out what to do. Sometimes there's jockeying for control. Sometimes there's questions about who should take the lead. So we talk about organizational challenges and a way to address those so that people understand, what's the most effective, efficient way to get everybody on the same sheet of paper, get everybody on board, whatever the right analogy you want or metaphor you want to use. We talk about the different delivery models. We've talked about public and private. Hybrid is, sort of using both, but using both makes it sound, oh, that's easy. It can be quite complicated. And we talk about those models, the different ways that you can implement them, how you take advantage of them, how do you get consistency across them, because, for example, Microsoft Azure and Amazon are quite different in the services they offer, the way they bill, and so forth and so on. So you need to understand, how do I manage that environment? Because again, you want to have consistent approach. Because if you just we have a group that does Amazon, we have a group that does Microsoft, we have a group that does our internal OpenStack, we have a different group that does this. It's quite complex. You've got to staff each of those groups. It's hard to cross-train. So we talk about how do you handle hybrid delivery things. And then, we really wrap it up with, okay, I want to have that sort of consistent approach that addresses all these challenges, that takes advantage of these capabilities, that can use any of these environments. How do I do that? How do I go about it? How do I get my organization on the right track? We have creating a cloud action plan as kind of the conclusion of that, so people leave with, not just a set of knowledge, but the ability to go forward and be successful.
That's excellent. That really sounds like it's an interesting course, Bernard. What are some of the advantages of the APMG qualification in the market compared to others? For example, I know there's a whole host of other cloud-based offerings in the market. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, one of the things that we wanted to do with this was we wanted to make sure that it addressed all of IT personnel. So that developers, operations, legal, finance, executive, because as I sort of, I think, have said, this is a sea change in the way that IT is done, and everyone's affected. This isn't just a way that developers work, or this affects the storage group. So it's critical that everyone have this foundation of knowledge, and that everyone be able to use it. So it deliberately is addressed toward all IT personnel and provide a foundation of knowledge. One of the important things is that it has an impartial perspective. This isn't a vendor-based approach. There's many vendors who offer cloud computing courses. The challenge with many of them is their content and their approach and their recommendations are really slanted around what they provide, the way they go about it, what they have to sell. And that's, fine for them, but if you're an organization
I think we've lost Bernard there for a
No,
minute.
I'm here. Sorry.
Back. Sorry. Okay.
You get a slanted view. You get one that doesn't provide, sort of a general basis of knowledge. They may not talk about other potential solutions. So, it has an impartial perspective deliberately so that you can know what the overall domain is. It draws on widely accepted resources as certification basis. So this isn't just one person's opinion or three persons' opinion. We sought out the best resources that provided the breadth of knowledge and the impartiality that could provide the foundation. So it's well-grounded. It's got a good basis of knowledge. It provides a complete knowledge foundation, so it covers all the topics. It's not just how do you develop applications, or what is storage, or what are the laws. It provides a foundation of knowledge. That's why it's called the Cloud Computing Foundation certification, and it does all that. It presents all the cloud delivery models, private, public, and hybrid, and doesn't slant toward one or the other. There's no axe to grind here that sort of says you have to do it this way. It's really designed to help people understand the benefits and challenges and the implications of all of those models and how to come up with a comprehensive plan that can leverage any or all of them. It addresses the benefits and challenges. This isn't just a hooray about cloud computing, but it's also not just a negative sky is falling kind of approach. And it's contained in a 2-day course, so it's very consumable. It's not something that's it's a 3-week boot camp or something like that. So we think this is quite a good approach, and that's what we've put together. And really, the feedback thus far has been quite positive about it. It's I came out of this really with a breadth of knowledge and the confidence that I really have a domain capability to go forward and figure out exactly what I'm going to go do.
Thanks, Bernard. Looking at the type of folk that should attend this, I mean, clearly all of the IT personnel should, and clearly all developers as well. But I see that you've included operations, legal, finance, executive members. That you're talking largely about many different types of people within an organization. So this clearly isn't just a technical course for IT folks on how to configure root reports, is it?
No. In fact, we don't really talk about those kinds of levels of detail. In terms of technical stuff. This is really designed to help people understand the sea change that cloud computing brings and how it affects all different aspects of bringing applications to production that use cloud computing. And that really affects a lot of people. We've talked about security and data regulation and so forth. That's clearly is a legal issue. And so, somebody who is in a legal department that needs to understand what this cloud computing thing is and kind of how these regulations read on that can come and gain benefit from it. Finance, cloud computing, I haven't really mentioned this, but one of the primary models of cloud computing is so-called pay-as-you-go. So think of it as, I'm going to rent a car rather than buy a car. Lots of implications about that. How do you ensure that you're getting good efficiency? How do you track what you're using? And the finance departments often find that quite confusing. Certainly purchasing departments, same thing. They're used to saying, I'm signing a contract and it's for a fixed amount. This varies or can vary. What do I do about that? Executives, as I said, CEOs are going, I need to be in the cloud. What does that really mean? And so it's important for them to understand what cloud computing is, what it brings to the table. And so, I guess I probably have said it several times, and what I'm really trying to get at is cloud computing is a pretty significant change across the entire environment, and it's really important that everyone who's going to be affected understand it. And that's why we designed the course, drew on the resources, and then developed the certification so that everyone in these organizations that will be affected by it can gain value from it.
Thanks, Bernard. I know I speak to a lot of service management folks, and they deal primarily in IT governance, service management, outsourcing, and they keep on telling me that they find it increasingly more and more difficult to manage and to provide the levels of service management that are necessary in the organization. And they keep on telling me that the contractual requirements are changing. The way that they're delivering service management, especially with their existing frameworks, the cloud seems to change the whole concept of how that fits together. Have you had experience like that?
Yeah, well, it's, there's so many things about it. So, one is the old model for IT used to be I buy stuff, I install it, configure it, and then I never touch it. It's very static, very stable. And so that fit a model that said I'm going to procure something, I'm going to have a fixed price for it, I sign the contract once, and then that sort of stops. Today, this is an environment where you get resources really quickly, so you may not even really have time for an extended contract negotiation. The resources themselves vary, change a lot. As I mentioned about that Netflix, they probably have an order, I would guess at least an order of magnitude change in the amount of resources they use, for their service. So, whatever they use at 2 in the afternoon, maybe 10 times that they're using in the evening, and then they shrink it back down. Well, that doesn't fit the model where, stuff is, I want to sign a fixed contract and have a certain amount. And then how do you deliver that? If you are someone who's responsible for delivering resources, how do you do that? And one of the things that the sort of the nirvana, or whatever you want to call it, for hybrid is I want to be able to take my application and run it wherever is the most efficient, effective, and cost competitive. So I may want to pick up that application and move it from on-premise to Azure. Well, that changes things around service management a lot because you've got to be able to run it in both those environments. You have to be able to track what your SLAs and your availability is. You have to really look at that. So it does have quite an impact on that sort of service management, service availability model. A lot of those organizations are, really challenged to say, well, how do I go about this? What are my, KPIs in that environment? How do I bring contracts to bear in that? Yeah, it's a real sea change for the way IT is done.
Very interesting. I think this is going to be our future for a long time to come. Do you want to give us a module example? So a little bit about, for example, security in the cloud. I think that's just a little example of what's in the course, huh?
Yes. So this is one that we've talked about or mentioned the importance of cloud security and the fact that we address it. So one of the things that's important is, particularly as you use public cloud, there's a shared responsibility. The provider is responsible for the infrastructure, the computers, how they're updated, the cloud software, meaning how do you actually use the cloud environment. That's all comes from the provider, and they're responsible for it. On the other hand, the responsibility for the application resides with the user. The cloud provider doesn't really know anything about it, and you don't really want them to know anything about it, right? Because you don't want them looking at your application. So you have responsibility. So it's a shared responsibility. And depending on what kind of cloud computing you're doing, whether it's infrastructure as a service or something like Salesforce, there's a trust boundary. Where is that line where it goes from being their responsibility to being your responsibility? You need to understand that trust boundary. How do you go about assessing a cloud provider's security? So I just said, they retain responsibility for the computing facility, all of the componentry, all of the software capabilities that provide the cloud functionality. Well, that's great, but how do you know if they're doing a good job or a terrible job? How do you know if they're, really following best practices, or, it's sort of a guy just down the street who is, looks in once in a while and so forth. So, how do you figure out what's the right practices? There's an organization, a global organization called the Cloud Security Alliance. They've done very effective work, and so we talk about their role and how you can leverage them to perform that assessment. And they've done a lot of work. They provide best practices, guidelines, so forth. We discuss that quite extensively so that people aren't doing it themselves. So they don't feel overwhelmed with, how do I start with doing that? Well, we talk about how to go about that via the Cloud Security Alliance. We talk about the cloud provider security certifications. By their very nature, they're not going to let you wander around their environment. You can't go in and say, show me your cages and so forth, because that would be good for you, but somebody else who uses their service would say, wait a second, I don't want somebody who from an organization I don't know wandering around this facility. So the way that cloud providers go about sort of being demonstrating capabilities in that place is they look for security certifications. So we talk about those certifications, which are the relevant ones, so forth and so on. Data privacy, I've mentioned several times, so we talk about that. We talk about how you figure out what's going on about that, ways to address those kinds of issues, how, who should be involved, and so forth. And then, service level agreements. What can you expect? What can you get if somebody doesn't live up to their service level agreements? How do you go about understanding what they provide or guarantee, and how do you hold them to that? So there's a whole range of topics that fit under cloud security, some of which you could argue aren't really security, right? So data privacy isn't exactly security. It's more about regulatory and legal requirements, but we address it in this cloud security module. So we have a comprehensive view of the overall issue of cloud security, which, as you mentioned, is the number one issue that people bring up. So we, of course, wanted to be sure that we address that.
Thanks, Bernard. Would you like to wrap up with some conclusions?
Yeah. So I think that I've, made mention several times. Adopting cloud computing really drives a need for common knowledge. You can't afford for something to be this important for everyone to have their own knowledge base or their own opinion or their own way of going about it. I mean, imagine, going back to that example of driving, imagine if every person on the road said, well, I figured it out for myself and my rules say I can drive on the left. And then somebody else said, well, wait a second, where I come from, we all drive on the right. And then somebody else says, but, and it's okay to make a turn in front of other people because I feel like that. It would be chaos. That would be a nightmare. I won't say it's quite as
sounds like Africa.
Well, I won't say that it's as life-threatening as if people did not have, cloud computing is not as life-threatening as if everyone had their own rules for driving, but it is quite critical that organizations have a need for common knowledge, a common knowledge foundation validation, common practices, and this certification is really, directed toward that. This is an APMG certification. It's the most widely adopted, I believe, and the most widely regarded, highly regarded certification body around the globe, and we followed the APMG practices and processes and so forth. So, you can be assured that it's a high-quality approach to this. It validates knowledge base, so, it makes sure that the knowledge that people come out with is, appropriate and valid because we follow that certification approach. It provides a comprehensive knowledge. So this, is the course and the certification cover all the domains. So it's not just how do I, install the right storage. It's how do I understand all the aspects of cloud computing that need to be addressed. And then it has a balanced view. As I said, it's not a vendor specific. It doesn't have an axe to grind. It's really, our goal was to let someone who comes out of this and gets a certification say, I really understand the whole domain of this, and I understand kind of a perspective around it that isn't biased one way or another by who provided the training.
Thanks, Bernard. We have some time for questions, a couple of minutes. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to type them into your chat box, and we can answer them. Some that have come in. So what kind of emerging technologies are on the horizon for cloud? What's going to impact cloud next? Is it a technical challenge? Maybe you can enlighten us a little bit, Bernard, about the new and upcoming things.
Well, I think that we're now into the second phase of cloud. So the first phase was, what is it, this is this strange beast. And now people are saying, okay, it's here to stay. It's a powerful trend. And now the challenges we're confronting aren't so much, what is this thing? I've sort of vaguely heard of it. It's now, how do I take advantage of it? And that brings a host of consequences. As I mentioned, application design and operation is a key one, but there's lots of different aspects of that. But beyond this sort of the challenges issue, I would say that, now what's happening is people are really starting to say, I have this computing capability that's available immediately. I only pay for what I use. I can grow and shrink as my application needs change. What can I do with that in a way that I couldn't do before? And so we're seeing, huge initiatives, innovation that assume cloud computing as the computing environment. I'll just give you, a couple of examples. Internet of Things, which is kind of a, you might call it a buzzword, or you might call it a very powerful trend, but all of that and all of the back end for that Internet of Things and mobile, I would say mobile and Internet of Things are very complementary. They're data being generated by external devices or being operated on, or sensors, which is a sensor, an actuator is something, that's something that gets done as a result of a signal being sent from the application. All of those things assume cloud computing. So, for example, you may have heard of the Nest thermostat. It's a new kind of smart thermostat put out by this company. It was founded by a fellow who came out of Apple who had worked on their iPhone. He founded this company to do smart thermostats that learn from your use patterns that you can control externally. Google spent $3 billion to buy his company. That all runs, all the back end for that, all the analytics that they run, all run in the cloud environment. So people are now, and I mentioned Netflix, we talked about that earlier. All of those companies say, I've got this capacity, this capability now, how do I build new things? And so it's a real engine for innovation, and that's something that is kind of the going forward. Not so much, it's a challenge that then says, how do I best take advantage of it? How do I really leverage it? To do that, you really need to understand it better, and that's the purpose of our certification.
Bernard, thank you very much. I personally have found this a very, very insightful webinar. On the screen at the moment for attendees, there's a list of a couple of the training providers that have already adopted this certification. How to get a hold of Bernard, there's some website information there. And I'd just like to say to everybody, thank you very much for attending. If you found this interesting, we will run another webinar in probably early in the new year. And this webinar has been recorded, so we'll send out details on how you can download it and replay it for those people who couldn't make it this afternoon, this morning. I'd like to say thank you to everybody, and we will be closing the webinar in a minute or two. So if you have any further questions, please type them in, otherwise we will close down. Thanks, everybody.